With the mentality of reinventing the conventions of Zelda firmly in mind, development was neck deep for this new ambitious approach for the next generation Zelda game. And while the world was well underway in being designed and brought forth, a beloved cast was also being made. Through numerous ideas, designs, and even altered races, today we shall explore the beta enemies and characters of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell too to further support us and keep creating new videos. Last time, we explored several concepts that were being planned for the game, many of which centered around our protagonist, Link himself, going through several iterations while deciding the direction of the whole game. To quickly go over them, these include a one-armed older Link, a Link whose arm could transform into weapons, a spacesuit Link, and a punk rock Link complete with a motorcycle and guitar. But once the setting was decided upon being a medieval setting by tradition, one thing they wished to mix up was Link's design. The green tunic was just expected at this point, and so several iterations of Link were made, some featuring the traditional tunic, some that mixed it up with a cloak, and the cloak definitely started to replace his traditional cap in many iterations following, until eventually coming to a design that was blue. According to Eiji Onuma, nobody on the team said, "Let's make him blue." It just organically ended up being that way. And so this was the new face of this fresh take on Zelda, and this design started to evolve too as development continued, with his gauntlets growing and becoming more detailed, the patterns on his tunic slowly changing into the shape of a sword, to soon even including a Sheikah slate on as a permanent addition. But of course, with Link comes Zelda. Unlike Link, who had designs that were still quite in line with what we know of a general look for Link, Zelda went through many varying designs. Some in a more generic princess outfit, reminiscent of her previous games, one with a more general civilian look too, also note the Sheikah slate in her hand, and two that had her looking like wildly different rich girls, and one that looked ready to adventure on a horse. There were two major contrasts here in design, one being a more general princess in a dress, the other being out and ready to adventure, and in the end, the team went with both styles. A design reflecting her formal wear, and as well a matching adventure costume for the intent of traveling out to research, but as well a third design with a simple white dress meant for training her powers, the same powers that were meant to be utilized for sealing the great calamity the game was being prepared for. But together with these two were 4 champions being made that were to be a symbol for each of the 4 main dungeons of the game, each coming from a specific race of Hyrule that grew and evolved over time. And to begin is with the Zora, who housed the champion Mipha. The Zora themselves started out looking rather different, 2 different races actually, one being the general grey Zoras we are used to at this point, and the other being these green ones that many may know best from A Link to the Past, called Zolas in the West, or River Zoras if you prefer. Potentially a rivalry was planned between both Zora races as part of a story element, but eventually coming to a design featuring a complete fish head on all of them, with many of them even being still clothed, both minimally and completely. This all being before they start to prefer nudity by the final game. And so we look closely at the champion Mipha herself, who initially could be said to have started out as this general sketch of a female Zora the team wanted to use, having the Zora crest over her head and body, but also wearing a cloak of sorts. The first official design followed, with her having several fins that came out of her body like a lionfish, that apparently would open up for combat at that, which would kinda defeat the purpose since they wished to design her as a spear user, and so they came to a much more simpler design that was clearly female in design, but also still needing a weapon for combat. However, Mipha also had family, starting with her brother Sidon, going through a blue and green iteration with one designed after a sturgeon fish and the other a hammerhead shark. Sticking to Mipha's design, the hammerhead made the most sense. Eventually, the team was comfortable with this neutral gray design, but soon the team realized a major flaw, and it was that he wouldn't be too noticeable in the dark and rainy Zora domain when Link first enters it. That and the design contrasted a lot with Mipha's red design, and so the team changed him up when modeling him in-game to a red color. King Doraphan being the father is next. He initially had 2 different designs, one resembling the fatter design of King Zora from Ocarina of Time, complete with an assistant who would keep him moisturized. The second is a more mobile design, even if still overweight, but looks more like an old veteran Zora warrior, complete with a coat he had then too. All coming to this giant white shark combo of the final game that made him far more muscular and truly deserving of being the king of Zoras. Moving on to Gorons, the Goron were more or less from the get-go designed with a design rather similar to their iteration from Ocarina of Time. Gorons in this iteration are shown in their most varied roles yet, with them wearing various headgear for their jobs, from miner, worker to warrior. However, some wackier ones were planned too, featuring some party headgear, which may have been a little out of place. But moving to the Goron champion Daruk, Daruk started with two initial designs, both seemingly meant from the get-go to show a warrior at his prime, an intentional design for being the leader of the Gorons. His first design was unhinged, with magma even flowing through him, having little hair but a large beard. The second design has him in much heavier armor instead, with a lot of hair but a smaller beard, and even had volcanoes on his shoulder. It was clear that these may have been a bit over-designed, so he was severely simplified by the final game, and now also given a lot of beard and hair to compensate. But another Goron did see an evolution in design, Daruk's very own descendant, Yunobo. Yunobo, being a descendant of Daruk, had his initial design in fact having Daruk's hair in a nice attention to detail, but over time he eventually was given more of a mohawk, standing to look more like a general Goron, but also unique enough to be his own character. After such a long while, the Rito were finally being brought back as a race. Unlike their iteration in the Wind Waker, the Rito were now more a collection of different birdmen. Going back to that original sketch, the Rito weren't even considered until the second iteration of the champion sketches, where they replaced the Kokiri as one of the 4 champions and were made from the get-go to use bows as their main weapon. In fact, the sketch of them had them using their feet to fire off arrows initially, before doubling their wings as hands. But along with that sketch, which had a similar birdman design, a later sketch was made that showed them dressed rather elegantly and wearing a hat too, something the Rito lacked in the final game, where they dressed a lot more simply, which made sense considering being overdressed would get in the way of flight. And their champion Revali was no different, as he was at one point also very overdressed, full cloak and hat. Revali was being set up as a character that could be considered as sort of a rival to Link, and thus his design was being based around that entirely. His bow, however, was very unique in that it was in the shape of stringed instruments, which is a motif with the Rito that has stayed into the final game with how musical they are. Eventually, like with other champions and his race, Revali was also simplified to the strong but regal design he has in the final game, down to even the bow. The Gerudo were potentially introduced with the second set of champion sketches, when they replaced the Sheikah here with a Gerudo. There was also emphasis on trying to curl their hair more originally too, in comparison to a straight-haired Zelda, but otherwise the iconic red hair, mainly ponytailed, with stereotypical Arabic fashion were planned right from the start. However, several designs did also exist of different variations of clothing, including a more belly dancer design too. Of course, the champion Gerudo did evolve eventually into the modern champion Urbosa. This was after looking like just another generic Gerudo. But of course, she'd blend in too well with everyone, so eventually she was given a much grander appearance, with much longer hair, but yet intentionally made to look more feminine to have a more motherly appearance, a representation of both a warrior and a motherly leader. Koroks were set to return again after their long absence since the Wind Waker. Originally, they were conceived as Kokiris, as seen in the original planned sketches of the champions. However, they were eventually made to be Koroks, and 900 of them were spread through Hyrule for Link to find and collect their seeds. Originally, their design was going to be a radical shift from their Wind Waker design, looking a lot leafier and with a wooden face instead, but they went with their design closer to their iconic Wind Waker design. A unique giant Korok was also made too this time, called Hestu, who is the person that would collect Korok seeds for an item slot upgrade. His design started out simply as a giant Korok, with little distinguishing features, even just simply holding a leaf. This all changed upon giving him actual tree branches and maracas by the end. While Kokiri were cut or altered, there is one truly cut race that was being planned, known as the Minish. The Minish were originally introduced in the game, the Minishka, and were set to appear in tiny villages in this game too. In this instance, Link was to shrink down and explore Minish villages similar to their introductory game. However, with already so many races in the game and with major characters that stood out, the team decided they would have to be cut. But of course, there were many other non-playable characters that were introduced throughout the game, from numerous Hylians to ones that weren't very human-looking even, including Kilton, a creature who was to buy and sell monster-related products to Link, originally being a traditional naked human hidden inside a large cart with all his gear, before becoming this creature with clothes and having a balloon and materials instead. Other prominent ones include the Bolson Construction Company and its flamboyant leader Bolson, who originally wasn't so flamboyant and much more of a rugged old man, a lot like the leader of the construction company in Ocarina of Time, of the Koichi Dye Shop being another who had a rather different early design, looking a lot more colorful too compared to his final counterpart. Great Fairies were set to return too, and with designs that changed grandly. Unlike their final sexier design, the initial Great Fairy looked a lot chunkier and looking more like a Buddha-inspired figure, which their entire surrounding is even covered in gold. Speaking of the surroundings, the fairy fountains also had many designs planned, each very unique from one another, unlike the slight differences of the final game. The fourth, of course, being the horse-related one, Melania, which also appeared to look very different in planning, looking absolutely fabulous. A lot more in line with the other Great Fairies in fact, and not so ominous like the final game. Imagine this one giving you threats about your life. But possibly the most prominent race of this game were the Sheikah. The Sheikah were set to return, and this time as a much grander race like never seen before, instead of them either being hidden or nearly extinct. And this was because the story of the game was taking influence from the mysterious Jomon period of Japan, which the Sheikah were to be instrumental in also having a mysterious past in this game, while themselves being a very Japanese heavy influence race to further be distinguished from others in game. And so they were expanded upon heavily this game with large ancient technologies of theirs spread throughout the game. Last time I mistakenly thought this might have been a Gerudo here, but in fact the earliest sketch of the champion included a Sheikah instead, as evident by the faint eye seen here. Very different from a typical Sheikah too, having far more of a dress-like attire and with dark skin instead of their typical lighter skin, strangest of all being the use of the hookshot to represent their race. The hookshot, however, would fit pretty well for a race of ninjas who could zip from place to place quickly with such a contraption, but being that this was the first major introduction as a race, a lot of thought was put into developing their designs, and eventually a set design was finalized for the tribe, including having an old woman on stilts to just general different clothing styles and proportions. Serious traditional characters such as Impa returned, along with new members such as Paya, and for the first time, male Sheikahs too. As such, we had a prominent character such as Robbie, who started out looking rather western in design and even had more hair all over the place, but evolved to have the traditional Sheikah design the game settled on. This was followed by another prominent Sheikah, Pura, who started out with a punk rock design and looking closer to a preteen before being aged down further and given a magical girl influence design for the final game. But being that the Sheikah were set to be part of the very race that started ancient technologies, the 120 mini dungeons or shrines were also set to be part of the creation and design, and so each of these were fitted with an ancient Sheikah monk. On the flip side, the game even introduced a group of rogue Sheikah called the Yiga clan, dressed in all red, obsessed with bananas, and worship Calamity Ganon, bringing us to the villains of the game. With there being such a large world this time, the enemies were set to be even more varied and scattered across the open world. The idea wasn't just to have enemies in spots for Link to fight, but for them to react to the world, from camping, cooking, eating, sleeping, and even looking up at the sky while it rains. And there were indeed a good variety that fit their various regions, from many forms of bokoblins, moblins, and Lizalfos, to even ones as mighty as Lionels, who may put the game's bosses to shame even. Lionels in this case were coming back for the first time since the series began, and with various forms at that. The large muscular design was clear from the get-go, but they appeared rather simple, but eventually with revisions received horns, more fur, and overall a lot more designed to the menace of the final game. Wizrobes are also ones with various forms for each element, starting out with rather unique designs originally, from a witch, Poe, and jester looking design to looking like this robed wizard. Choo-choos were also another elemental monster for each region. There was going to even be plans for a form planned for this one where it would open up to have a giant eye in the middle in a rather horrendous fashion. And of course, a Zelda game isn't complete without keys, and this time also with elemental versions. In the planning stages here, they had an even more bat-looking design and a comically looking round mouth for attacking. This further extends to Octoroks, who now have both an offensive water form to a grounded stealth form, whereby they would have an item on their head but hidden underground to trick Link. One even included a duck, which was gone by the final game. But alas, further rougher looking designs were even planned too, before we got the rounder model of the final game. However, the major difference this time was that it wasn't just these regular enemies in the open world, but several boss monsters were set to appear too, with their very own HP bar at that. These include golems, such as the Stone Talus, as well as the rather popular Hinox also, which appears like a super bokoblin of sorts, and this beast had a massive amount of revisions he went through. The one-eye feature was very clear from the start, but details and even colors changed heavily as they went forward. In fact, he was even set to be a bigger menace by attacking civilians, animals, and just overall rather active. But that might have been a little overpowered, so eventually he was made to just constantly sleep until he hears Link nearby. And last of the field bosses being the Desert Smolduga, being a sort of a whale for being in the desert, originally having a more intricate tail and ears too, which even glowed in the dark. But soon it was simplified to more of a muted design for the final game. But along with the more prominent enemies of the game were the Guardians, a new set of enemies that were ancient and hazardous compared to anything else in the game. At first they explored these with at least 4 organic looking guardians, alluding to plans for a darker Zelda, including a spider with many eyes, a giant enemy crab, a creature straight out of Doom, and Slenderman, all appearing to be massive next to Link. But then they decide on Mechanical Guardians, a brand new take on bringing futuristic looking enemies to the series, shrunk down to be closer to Link's size. Coming in various designs, at least 4 more were designed that were scrapped. The first is this one that looked like a direct predecessor to the final Guardian, but looking a lot rounder and monotone. The next one that looked similar to the final, but with many capacitors on his head. Then we got one that is covered in moss, but with a glowing disc on its head. But the most interesting one is this humanoid looking Guardian, looking a lot like a cut Twilight Princess enemy, capable of shooting its lasers from his chest, eventually settling down on a more simpler spider-like design, for the more general designs at least, aside from the turret and the Skywatcher variants of course. But while these races of Hyrule and enemies filled the fields of this massive new Hyrule, the dungeons themselves had their own unique bosses. The bosses of this game were all based on the main evil of the game, Calamity Ganon. Each of the 4 dungeons having what is known as a blight, which were essentially Phantom Ganon, much like the one from Ocarina of Time, made by Calamity Ganon to take control of the 4 divine beasts, each with a unique element and weapon type, while all sharing a black body and red hair, but overall different proportions from one another. However, the main villain himself, Calamity Ganon, had a massive journey to get to where he is today. Like Link, he shared a few concept arts for ideas, including a punk rock Ganondorf to accompany this Link, and even a version of Ganondorf in the sky. Eventually, they went with a less human and more malice form to Ganon this time around, given 3 forms to accompany it. A cocoon form to hold this form, an incomplete form when the cocoon hatches too early, and a true form in the form of Dark Beast Ganon, looking a lot more like the Beast Ganons we are familiar with. And originally it started out in a more flesh state in that form, by growing his malice around his body. This design further evolved to one that had him even upright like some of the more classic designs, but in the end they made him a true beast, making him purely from malice to make him the final boss of the game. Next time, with the world and characters coming together, the team was pushing forward to refining the game for launch, only to be hit by a sudden surprise that could have threatened development. And so in our final part, we shall explore the lead up to launch and all the last minute plans for the game that were ultimately cut but still found their way into the final game too, including a special mystery around the sword that seals the darkness. So make sure to hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back for more Zelda and other games cut content and history soon. Hit the like button and comment below on which design you wish had stayed into the final game. So everyone, thank you for watching.